as with all of these things, in the PowerPoint slides, and it's quite apt if you can see that, you'll see the note pages underneath. If you do download the PowerPoint, you will find that underneath in the notes pages, there are lots more notes that I'm not necessarily going to mention today, but are background to where some of the things that I'm going to talk about. So we're going to have a look at the general marking principles with it GCSE Stats, look at some of this very, very quick, why I've chosen certain questions. And then I've put a note there about some of the extended answers we're not going to be able to go into in great detail for reasons that will become very clear. But we are doing some more training. We've got 3 training sessions for statistics being done over this academic year. One of them is specifically looking at extended answers, and Seb will probably drop the dates for those in. So whilst we will cover some of more extended answer questions, we're not going to go into lots and lots of details because there's lots more to cover as well. At this point, I always talk about the practice versus theory. It is important you understand how mark schemes are marked when it comes to live assessments, but what you choose to do in your setting for mocks up until that live assessment is entirely up to you. Because in practice, when it comes to our internal assessments, we tend to mark harshly. And the same comes for whichever element of maths we do, because then when it comes to the real thing, you've almost eradicated some of those silly mistakes because you've marked harshly, and they will only make that mistake once. But equally, it is important you understand the fundamentals of the marking principles for when it comes to reviews of marking, appealing remarks in the summer, because then that gives you the ammunition and the skills to be able to go for an appeal. So is it different? I ask myself every year, because this is now the 3rd year I think we've done the marking principles for stats, to GCSE maths. Yes, it is, in terms of some of the codes don't exist. We don't have a process mark, but we do have the method mark, the accuracy mark, we have the unconditional mark. So all of those you'll be used to. The general marking principles are underwrite or overrides the whole marking process in the summer. At the front of the papers. Rarely will you read them, and what I've tried to do is choose questions that exemplify the questions we usually get asked. So what about choice of method, or when do they need to show working, when don't they? And I know some of you will be sat there and will instantly have questions. I'm hoping that I've preempted those questions by the examples I've chosen, and that will become clear. And where working is not, that's moved out the way. Where working is not required, it should be given full marks, and it's really obvious. Again, you'll see those exemplars that I've chosen. These are the bits that aren't in the stats mark schemes that are explicit in the GCSE maths. So they don't explicitly have the brackets being used, but you do see them being used, but it's not there as an underlying principle. So they're not explicit. The use of the inverted commas, but the way that's overcoming the stats is that we talk about follow-through marks, which means you have to follow through using their numbers, which covers the words in the square brackets. Similarly with misreads. And misreads is an interesting one as to whether or not you accept them. Personally, I will accept them for live, or I know that they happen for live sit-ins, but I won't look for misreads when it comes to my internal marking, because I want them to make sure that they're reading the question and they're taking their time and processing it and all that other nice stuff. So it is slightly different, but you do need a reminder. So, and the way these usually work is I've taken the skills map. And if you haven't seen the skills maps, they just show you all of the performance data for, in this case, grades 5, the average grade 5 student, what they scored across the board, getting an average of 56 points. So the average grade 5 student, 56.4 marks. And what's really interesting is that the front of the paper, and it was commented on in the examiner's reports, that they were really able to access the first 5 questions, but question 6 proved to be more challenging. And that's my prompt to you: go and read the examiner's report, because at the back end of the examiner's reports, as I said on the feedback session I did a few weeks ago, is there's a load of other information that talks about what we need to practice, what we need to make sure they because it's obvious that sometimes they may not have been taught it. So things like practice extended response question, reviewing key terms, but that's all detailed at the back end of the papers. So I've chosen questions that will pull out specifically some of those key principles, but also that as I was going through, and my health warning at this point is, if you consider how much training a marker has to mark in the live sittings in the summer, they will, if you've never marked, it works like this: you get some familiarization time where you go in and you get used to the system. And then you have to complete some practice set questions. And then you have to qualify. So for each set of questions, you have to do a practice and a qualification. And if there's a tolerance for which you have to pass to be able to go on to live marking. But and you're only given probably sometimes 12 questions, it's not a whole paper. It might be 15 part questions or whole questions. It depends on how they've cut the segments up. But that practice and qualification can take 4 or 5 hours. And that's just for a small chunk of one paper. So to think that I'm going to be able to train you to the level that a summer marker would get. So I've had to choose specific questions to pick out specific points. And that's what the delegate pack is. I probably won't get through all 4 papers. I never do. But then you can go through the rest of the delegate pack along with the slides and look at the rest of the comments, because the comments make it clear as to what would be awarded with each response. They are proper student responses, with the caveat that they have been handwritten by me to protect the identity of the student. But they are true students' responses from the summer 24 series of papers. And that's what you've got in your delegate pack, is an attempt by me to show you a student response and a mark scheme. I've tried to get them so that it's within context, so it makes sense, that rather than just, I'll work out the total number of items, you can see where they were asked to do it. So in this case, they had to complete the pictogram in part A. And work out the total number of ice creams in part B. That was actually awarded. It was only part B that I wanted to look at here, but you can see they completed the pictogram. Let's just move you out the way there. So for 2.5 images, the images don't all have to be the correct size, but they would have got the correct marks for part A. But part B here, they've got the method for the total number, but they've added them up incorrectly, so they don't get that accuracy mark. And so that's the way this is going to work. We've got a whole selection of images and mark schemes. Part 1, paper 1, question 1, part C and D. This is where in my early days, I always felt I needed the support, and it was understanding what students had written and how that related to, because very, 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 very rarely will they write exactly what's been written in the mark scheme. And it will be a word or two that's out that you might think, oh, that's a bit like that, because you know the students, and that's where a little bit of unconscious bias slips in, I suppose. So if any doubt, ask a colleague, does this mean the same thing? So when we look at what they've done here, they have stated the values. So they've stated that they Saturday was 18 and Sunday was 45. But what was interesting with this is that it's only B1 because there is no comparison. They haven't made any elements of comparison between the two numbers. Or the size of the key. Sorry, I went brain dead then. And then the second part, this is something that we picked up as something, an area we need to work on, which is why I chose the question to look at, is appropriateness. And we're going to have a look at this in a training session about whether or not we use sentence starters or what we can do to improve this. And they've got a correct conclusion. Again, really nice thing, if nothing else, when it comes to these questions where they have to make a decision. And I've exemplified this in a later question. They have made a decision, i.e. decided it's not appropriate, but then they have made an attempt at a reason. Because they've said that customers would want a different flavour next week, which is, we could interpret that as highlighting a large variation in data, which was 0.5 in the mark scheme. That's the kind of thing that would refer to. But if they had just written the data wouldn't be appropriate with no conclusion. But it says there with an attempt at a reason. Their reason could be something really banal and something unrelated, but they have made, and I wasn't aware of this until recently, it's that attempt at a reason that is important. We don't want to encourage them to write something that's not related. We want them to write something because it triggers the fact that they could get that first or that unconditional mark there, that B1. But in that case, they got 2 because they said it wasn't appropriate, and they've given a correct reason. Moving on to paper 2, part C and D. We've got here, they've given the correct, the 2 correct comparisons, because they're comparing France 2003 to 2013, the UK 2003 to 2013. But those percentages stated, whilst they're correct, they weren't required. And in most instances, a conclusion could have been drawn from comparing the heights, the difference in the heights in the bar chart. And you'll see the original start the question up on the top right there. So they didn't need to have the numbers there. It is something, I have to be honest, that's probably is the way I would have taught it anyway, to talk about looking at numbers rather than heights. But we all choose to teach slightly different. And then part D is an incorrect response. So if you look at the mark scheme, because it's they've said it is appropriate, whereas it's not appropriate. And so any response that starts, it is appropriate, is incorrect. And there are certain questions where let me phrase this properly. There's certain questions where there is only one answer, i.e. yes, it is valid, or no, it's not valid. And then there are others, and again, the mark scheme makes it clear that says it could be appropriate, or it is appropriate if this. So it's like a conditional response. But in this case, any response that started, it is appropriate, was incorrect. The same question with a different response from students. You can see here, they stated that there was a bigger overall difference in France. France increased in visitors, the UK decreased in visitors. They actually didn't need the top line there to have gained 2 marks. They could have got the 2 marks just by saying France increased in visitors, UK decreased in visitors. That is a valid comparison. And then part D, B0, it is an incorrect response. And again, this is something that came out loud and clear about appropriateness of diagrams, appropriateness of different statistical averages, and when we can use them is something that we've got to work on. And by we, I talk about the royal we, us as a nation of teachers. Then we've got, again, another response, because I thought this was quite interesting one from, especially because it had that appropriateness. And the comparison one, what do we mean by comparison? And this summed it up. So if we look here, all they have done is stated the percentages. They have read the information, but they haven't compared them. So they have so there's no marks awarded for it, because in the true sense of the word, they have just pulled the data, but they haven't said that what happened. So the 22 to the 14%, which is a decrease, or the other one is an increase. And again, B0 for it was an incorrect response. So that comparison, we've thinking about how do we teach students what a comparison is. It's not just about reading the information. Then we move on to 3B. Again, I have chosen lots of the wordier responses because they're the ones that students will find. You have a class of 30 students, ask them to answer that question, you would get 30 different responses. But in that case, it is an example of that they couldn't measure the number of people accurately. So the second point down. So there is a bit of professional judgment to be used. Then we've got another example, may not be accurate. Again, depends on where students are coming from. When they think about accuracy in maths, some people's instant reaction will be to talk about numerical accuracy. And in this case, they did say because they only code to 2 decimal places. And there is a reference to the numbers are rounded for the first point. It's not sure it's something it would have been on my list, but again, for loads of you out there, it will be the first thing that you talk about when you're talking about using data. Then we've got it could be secondary data. So again, B1. It's a valid answer from the students. Question 3C. I thought this was interesting just to show you when it comes to you marking your mocks or you going for reviewing scripts in the summer. So they were asked to compare, and in this case, the comparison, it's a really minimal response that was awarded 1 mark because it clearly indicates the trend. And so the one of the marks for correct conclusion without the use of figures, what they haven't done is then articulated the reason, but that is a minimal response that would have allowed them to get 1 mark. So sometimes it might be a case of not overcomplicating it or simplifying it. Same question, very common answer to C was negative correlation, but the question is testing trend and not correlation. And if you look on the right-hand side of the full guidance, which I don't think I included on that, to be fair, any relation to correlation wasn't accepted in that case. Right, then this one, it's a similar, again, same thing when the marking feedback, there's lots of themes that come through. And when we look at the market, one of the themes that is coming through is, what does it mean to compare? How do we teach students, or we need to teach students what it means to compare? And in this case, we can see the student was given 1 mark. They were given the mark for the word decreases. So any adjective, a little bit of literacy and maths there, i.e. the word slowly, could be ignored. Any quoted figures could be ignored because this was testing the students' understanding of trend. So yeah, there we go. So I am just making sure we go referring back to my notes. Because they were there for a reason, to make them useful to you and useful to me. Right, but then another student chose to use the words negative correlation, and then the correct description for the trend was seen. So this is really comforting to see, but in this case, we ignore the words correlation. So we're condoning the inclusion of it, and it could be awarded 1 mark. Whether or not comes back to that practice versus reality, whether or not you choose to do that, but it's nice to know for, like I say, any reviews or appeals. And that's because one of the principles of marking is we try to mark positively. So I thought that was nice to see, to show, because I took a lot of comfort from that, to be fair. And then we got, like I said, I wasn't going to do a lot of extended answers, but there is a point where we have got some extended answers. So this one was looking at median, range, and again, those comparisons and interpretations. And you can see in this case, they've compared their median with 90 and said that it has increased. They've then said in the final 9 matches, the team has clearly become better. If they'd only said had become better, that would have been enough. They have compared the range by saying it has decreased from 96 to 25, and showed that the team is more consistent as the best and worst score is not as far apart. That is not as far apart thing. There's probably a more eloquent way of wording it, but like I say, that's what this particular student did. So in this case, there was 4 marks, the full 4 marks awarded. And again, I think it's something that we can build on to look at the structure of the response from students to how can we build some question banks where we are training students to use this, what's going to get them full marks. And then the same question, I thought, well, let's have a look at another student's response. They've made a comment about the final matches, the median was higher. They've stated which means they have a better score. They've then stated which has the higher range, but there was bigger outliers wasn't a sufficient interpretation. And I think it's right that that's the case. So it's almost like we can, and bullet points are accepted along with most of these sentence questions. Moving on to 5C, appropriateness. Again, it's something my little challenge is to try to improve questions answered in relation to appropriateness. If we look at it, yes, it is appropriate. So they've got the mark. There is an attempt at an answer. And in this case, it was the correct attempts to reason. They've got it right. We accepted on, again, same part of the question. It is a fair assessment. Was accepted as it is appropriate. Because sometimes that's the kind of language we use. Because it implies appropriateness. And again, the correct reason was given, so 2 marks. So again, thinking about, it doesn't have to just be, it is appropriate. There are others that were condoned. Same question, different response. And this is, it's almost that you think of the ability, the attainment of students, as you move down the attainment, their responses become a little bit more woollier. That I haven't mentioned whether it is appropriate, so they haven't made that conclusion. So it doesn't fit the pattern to all the other numbers. It's similar to saying we would have expected a score of 1, or we would have expected all the scores to be similar, sorry, the 4th point there. But they haven't actually mentioned appropriateness. They haven't actually answered the question. So just the 1 mark there. Then, question 6, we're talking about hypotheses. Suggest a hypothesis. This is what a student wrote. 0, it's not a hypothesis. It is a reason as to why perhaps the student should open, the gym should open longer. So they got nothing. So just making sure that students do understand that. Part E of the same question I thought was interesting is, so the final part of this is, two reasons why the manager might do this, to predict the outcome, and to change the questionnaire. So predicting the outcome is incorrect. The point of the second reason, changing the question, was the one that they were given the mark for there. Because it's not about predicting the outcome, it is about allowing them to change. And I think that comes under allowing them to make improvements. So even though it's 1 sentence, you do look to mark positively where we can. 7, the pictogram, not the pictograms, the pie charts. Just make sure we're done on time. Part A and B, again, there was so many different things that could have been compared. And you look at the table that you're given there. And in this case, they were given 1 mark because houses are the greatest in both. So that was in the additional guidance. They got the 1 mark there instead of the 2. And then when you look at the second bit, assess the validity. Again, they have said, and this is a case of that it might not be valid. So it's not just, in this case, the student had given that it might not be valid and it was a correct reason. But I mentioned about that some questions have that dual response depending on the reason given. So, and this was one of them where it's not valid if this happens, but it is valid if this happens. So look out for those. These kind of ones are not ones where they would get a mark for saying it is valid with an attempt at a reason. That reason must be stated. They must have, and it must almost make a little bit sense. Otherwise, it's a 50-50 guess. I'm just going to write for those kind of questions. It will be valid or not valid. And then at the back end of the paper, we've then got some crossover questions. Was the probability tree? They got 2 marks here, fully correct tree. But then the last part where they've said about Matthew correct, there is no marks available for them unless they have made a calculation. And I know that sounds really obvious. And I'm preaching to the converted. But when I looked at this, I was like, well, that actually, I know mathematically it's not correct because you can calculate the probability. I was like, actually, he's had a good crack at explaining the logic behind it, but hasn't actually calculated it. And if you weren't a math specialist with no understanding about, but understand the probabilities can be calculated. So in that case, they got nothing. And there was 4 marks available for that second part. So, but that's the very last question on foundation. We've got the crossover element that appears on both. Explain why your answer to part A is a reference, is only an estimate. Any reference to secondary data does not explain why it's an estimate, so there's no marks. Repeating the calculations is a good, or checking is a good technique, but not what we're testing here. So no marks for the second part. And again, you see that's definitely not laid out in part I. And then part C, so while it could show patterns and trends, it doesn't explain why or why not frequency polygons are appropriate. So there was no marks awarded at all for this student. And again, same kind of themes coming through about that appropriateness. And you'll see the next response slightly different, albeit not full marks either. So we've got the use of class widths, or, and in this case, the use of class widths or not exact values were both good enough alone to get that to score the mark, but that there was a truly strong response. The second one, improving accuracy, using the exact values, was accepted as using the raw and group data, being synonymous with the second point on the mark scheme. And then this one, there's actually not a reason. That's not a, there's no reason offered as to why it's not, as to whether it is appropriate to use a frequency polygon. So 0 for that. But the first two parts they gained the marks on. Foundation paper 1, bear in mind this is a crossover question, so this is the start of the higher tier. And we start seeing some more eloquent responses, I suppose, in some cases. So the percent, this one, when you go through it, they didn't calculate either the percentages, and you may, the delegate pack's there for you to work through and test yourself, and you can take the delegate pack and go through the rest of the papers, because we will get through halfway through the higher, as I said, and have a little go at marking some students' responses against what the presentation then says they got marked. So this one, they didn't calculate either total percentage for 50 to 54. And they weren't on their diagram either, because their diagram was blank. They did read off the percentages for males aged 50 to 54, but they would have needed to read off all 4 percentages, males and females, in order to get this M mark, the first method mark, if they hadn't added to get the totals. So they did calculate the number of males aged 40 to 44. Because the correct rounded answer there does imply multiplication. And so even if where they've got those two, so they've calculated 3.4% and 4.1%, even just one of those would have got them the mark. And then, so there was first 2 marks they didn't get, the second 2 marks they did get, and then because the second mark, and this is where it gets a little bit complicated. So they didn't calculate, they couldn't get the first method mark, and they didn't get the first accuracy mark. So those first 2 lines, they didn't get those. Then they did get M1, A1 for the next 2 lines. But then the final B mark there, where it says dependent of B1 FT, which means it's an independent mark depending on a follow through. So they can use correct follow through if they've just made a numerical mistake. It's dependent on, and if you look on the right, it's dependent on getting M1, M1. So it's not dependent on 2 marks, it's dependent on 2 method marks. So in this case, they'd got M0, A0, so they didn't get that first method mark, which meant they couldn't achieve that final independent mark. So worth looking out for that. In my early career, for a long time, I was like, oh, that's 2 marks. They've got M1, A1. That maybe I could, so I'll give them that. And in this case, it clearly says that it has to be M1, M1. I'm hoping that makes sense. We're talking about positive correlation when we're talking about skew. So even though the word positive is seen, it's used in the context of correlation. So in this case, it's wrong and scored 0. There wasn't a correct response alongside it. So, and it's obvious that they're talking about correlation rather than it is positive. Then the next student talks about it is a positive skew as more people took 20 to 25 minutes. So the correct description of skew is seen and scored the first mark. And even though it is a correct response, correct fact about the histogram, it's not a correct interpretation of skew. So it didn't score the second in B1, second B mark. However, what a correct response looks like is this. It is a positive skew. The median is more to the left than the right of the diagram. The correct skew was identified, and then reference to the medians being to the left of the diagram is the correct description. So if you're looking for a waggle, that's what a good one looks like. Then we're going to get on to higher paper 1. Similar thing, obviously, the last 3 questions we've just looked at are the first 3 questions on the higher tier. Skills map, again, you can see the blue there, we've just done question 2, 3 and 4. Not every question does get seen, by the way. And in terms of the higher paper 1, most students responded well to the paper. And again, if you look at the notes, you'll see a load of other topics that we can work on to improve. Paper question 1, interestingly, on this wasn't a crossover question. So in the same way that the last question on paper, on the foundation paper, wasn't on higher, question 1, the crossover question started at question 2. So question 1 was asking people to make an assessment using the data in the table. And then we look at this, Bob's claim may not be correct as the total labour work, but then the reason wasn't correct. So they got 1 mark for that. Again, they've made an assessment of the claim, i.e. said whether it would be accurate or not accurate, and then they have attempted a conclusion, which enables them to get that 1 mark. Higher paper 1, question 5, D&E. They were being asked to describe how a sample could be selected. So they managed to talk about taking number all the 60 employees, but there was no mention of, i.e. I'm then going to select every 10th person. And then there was also no mention of having a random starting point. So in that case, for the first part, and I know some of you will be sat there going, but that's exactly what the mark scheme says. Yes, it does. And I suppose that's what this session's about, really, is to enable you to read the mark schemes, and once you've seen some responses that when you initially look at, you go, oh, yeah. It's not as succinct as we would like it to be. So the first part D there, they were only got 1 out of 3. And then how would you use in a face-to-face interview? You're being told about it instead of reading it on a piece of paper. It's not correct. 6A, they have mentioned that it's a positive trend or rising, and they have correctly interpreted it in terms of the context. They're talking about the number of visitors is increasing, so they got the full 2 marks for that. Then we got 6C. I thought this was interesting because whilst this student has got the correct calculation there, they get the method mark, and they have got 68.3. They haven't got the correct sign because it's a negative, so it should have been minus 68.3. But they still get the method mark. And it's a range of answers that is acceptable, so it's not just as simple as it's not negative, so they lose the. I like the fact that when we have ranges, it allows students to make a slight error, I suppose, or a misjudgment. 7A, I like to have guidance about exactly, as a maths teacher, I don't know whether it's just me, or maybe it is because I'm a maths teacher, I'm very black and white. Tell me exactly what words are acceptable and what's not. I know we're not going to get all of them. And I would like to see that more in the mark schemes that we get, not necessarily for the summer exams, but for us to use in our teaching, where they give us more examples of, oh, we did accept. In this case, respected is equivalent to trustworthy. But I would like more of that. I think that would help. 7C, but by doing that, I don't want it to limit what what we've got now, where we have got a little bit of leeway, because when we talk about the 7C, when they're talking about proportions, one of the questions that are on here either now or on the higher paper or later on, they were allowances given. It was condoned that they could use the word number instead of proportion. But again, that was detailed in the mark scheme, and I thought I quite like that. The comparative pie charts also shows the difference in sizes and not just in proportion. So they're making reference to it being in proportion by saying not just in proportion. So they were able to get B1 for that. They could get the second one because comparative pie charts, they say that it will show more people in 2003. But they didn't actually make a decision in terms of what advice would you give to them on the choice of their charts. Question 10. Fully correct response, which I thought I'm going to choose this because we've got some numerical process stuff and we've also got some written words here. And to show how, not necessarily how it's extinct, but there is almost a process which the student goes through to gain those marks on those wordier sections. They've got the correct mark, minus 0.5. They got the M1A1, M1A1 for 58.8. They didn't need the 2. And then they've got 2 correct conclusions. That Dominic is incorrect, and then Kai is correct, with the reasons made for both statements. So fully correct. And I think that's nice to see sometimes that there are students getting the full marks on these, where there is a combination of the process and the wordy or extended answers. There is then, on the rest of these slides, and I'm not going to go through them because I am really conscious of time, is the same thing for the foundation. You've got your skills map, examiner's report. We've then got a load of questions. There might be one or two as I flick through these that now are going to, like this one, I think it's worth talking about. It's the question is talking about hours per week, I believe, or days per week they go to the gym. But they've used the word hours. That was forgiven. So it was condoned. I thought that was worth showing you. Question 3E, median. So this is the one where they've correct answer with they've had an attempt at a reason. And we're not accepting mode at all on that question. Let me go through my notes just to pick out, because it's so right, this one is easy to I thought this one, what is the overall height of each bar? It's the overall total points. It's not the number. We needed a reference to points from wins and draws, not the amount. And that came through with another example I found where it's the points. It's nothing to do with goals. Then the same question, this one here, wants to draw attention to the fact that this one scored absolutely nothing. They've used the word whereas and whilst in order to say that this is a comparison, or they're trying to, and it is something I suppose lots of us will do when we're trying to teach. How do we teach the skills for comparisons or making comparisons? So what they could have done, rather than showing you why they didn't get it, I should tell you that if they had written something like Queen of the South scored 24 points from wins, whereas Dunferm or DA scored only 21 points, that would have been a comparison. And is the inclusion of the word, I suppose, only scoring 21 points. It's a very tricky one, that is. Then we go through, but like I say, you can go through these at your own response. There's a couple I just wanted to point out. The last one on foundation. No, that might be that one. Stratified sampling. Yeah, that one. They only needed to get the first mark, they only needed a correct calculation. It didn't need to lead to an answer. And the second B mark comes from a correct answer. So in this case, they were given 2 marks for that response. But do go through the slides, read the comments at the bottom, and I want one more, which is the higher paper. The notes pages will really lead you through this. The stem and leaf, back-to-back stem and leaf, that is not a suitable key. So they got a correct stem and leaf diagram, an unordered stem and leaf diagram. Let me find it again. So they only got 1 mark. So in order to get the full 2 marks, it needs to be ordered. And then the key isn't suitable. What also wasn't suitable that I do need to bring to your attention is that we would allow the key to be in 2 parts, but this didn't have 2 lines on either side of the stem. And because they haven't got that, but we would allow it without the 2 lines if it had clearly been labelled as England and Welsh. But in this case, they did neither, so it was an unsuitable key. You could argue, if you wanted to say, well, is it because they've written the key for England under England and the key for Welsh under Welsh? That's a different argument. But we would have needed that to be labelled as Welsh and England because they didn't have the 2 lines around the stem. And I just thought that needed pointing out because that's going to be really common when it comes to your response, to your own student responses. But like I say, go through them at your own time. There is a load of comments at the end. Then it just comes to the end and the timing of that is almost perfect. And that's me done. And I hope it was useful to you and have a nice evening.